Study of Poetry by Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold is an English poet, essayist, and critic. He belongs to Victorian era. This essay, Study of Poetry, was originally written in 1880. It was first published as the introduction to T.H. Ward's anthology, The English Poets. Later, it appeared in Essays in Criticism. In this essay, he criticizes the art of poetry as well as the art of criticism. Arnold says that the art of poetry is capable of high destinies, that is, it is capable of higher uses. It helps to interpret life for us, to console us, and to sustain us. Here in this essay, Arnold terms poetry as the criticism of life. For him, science is incomplete without poetry, and religion and philosophy will give way to poetry. He says readers should recognize the qualities which produce the best poetry. A reader estimates poetry in three ways: historic estimate, personal estimate, and real estimate. Now, what is the historic estimate? It is analyzing a poem based on historical importance. It raises poetry to a high pedestal and thus hinders one from noticing its weaknesses. Now, what is personal estimate? It is analyzing a poem based on personal taste, likes, dislikes of the reader. Now, the third one, real estimate. It is the unbiased viewpoint that takes into account both historical context and the creative faculty to judge the worth of poetry. Now, Arnold says that if a poet is truly a classic, his poetry will give the reader real pleasure and enable him to compare other poetry which are not of the same high standard. And Arnold demands the readers to read classics to rate the proper value of poetry. Here he speaks about the idea of imitation. He says, if a poet wants his work to reach the high standards of the classics, he might consciously or unconsciously imitate those classic writers or those ancient poets. The historic estimate affects the study of ancient poets, while the personal estimate affects the study of modern or contemporary poets. In this essay, he discusses about the touchstone method. That is very important. The touchstone method. It's a comparative method to analyze the standard of a poem. He borrows this method from Longinus, who talked about the idea of sublime. He proposes this method of analyzing poetry in order to determine whether the poetry is of a high standard or not. And he says the classical poems pleases us all times, irrespective of age, place, or taste. Hence, they are sublime. To be a great poet, one should imitate the classical writers. He quotes Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, and Milton in an attempt to exemplify the touchstone poetry. He then agrees to Aristotle's idea of idea about poetry by saying that the best form of poetry possesses high truth and seriousness, along with superior diction. And this high truth and seriousness that which make up its subject matter, like that the superior diction which makes its manner. Then he speaks about the French poetry, which had a tremendous influence on the poetry of England, of course. He says the poetry of southern France, which influenced the Italian literature. Like that, the poetry of northern France, which influenced the English poetry. The poetry came to England with the Anglo Normans. Then Arnold speaks about Chaucer. He was much influenced by French and Italian poetry, as we all know. His importance comes from real estimate and not from the historical estimate. The superiority of his verse lies in its subject matter and style. And Arnold calls Chaucer's diction as the liquid diction because of the fluidity in Chaucer's writing. Later he says that Chaucer lacks high seriousness and thus he is not a classic. For him, Milton and Shakespeare are classics. Then he talks about Dryden and Pope. And according to historical estimate, they are great poets. And they wrote prose better than poetry, so they are classics of prose. Then he speaks about Thomas Gray. And he did not write much poems, but what he wrote had high poetic value. So Arnold calls him a classic. Then he talks about Robert Burns. According to Arnold, Robert Burns is a better poet in Scottish than in English. His poetry has content and style but lacks seriousness. So, he is not a classic for Arnold. Next, he talked about Lord Byron, Shelley, and Wordsworth. But he does not pass any comments or judgments on these poets because Arnold says that they are closer to his age, and so he will have a personal bias when he judge these poets and their works. And he says their poetry is of personal nature because they are all belongs to the Romantic age. Then he concludes his essay by saying that the human nature will remain the same throughout the ages. Thus, the classics that wrote on human nature will preserve themselves and stand the test of time.